nannies ran screaming from the vampire king's daughter. The deaf princess's uncontrolled power destroyed everything she touched, trapping her in silence and fear. Then a desperate human maid sat on the floor, tapped a simple rhythm, and did what centuries of experts couldn't. She made the little girl feel heard. The chandelier exploded first. Crystal shards rained down like frozen tears across the marble courtyard as Princess Seraphina pressed her small hands against her temples and screamed without sound. Her mouth opened wide, but no voice came, only the terrible, invisible force that rippled outward in waves of pure psychic energy. "Get back!" King Aldrich Varen roared, his crimson cape billowing as he threw up a protective barrier. Too late. The newest nanny, a decorated child psychologist from the Northern Territories with 40 years of experience, flew backward through the air and crashed into a stone pillar. She crumpled to the ground, blood trickling from her nose. "I quit," she shrieked, scrambling to her feet with wild eyes. "That child is cursed. She'll kill us all." The woman didn't even collect her belongings. She ran, her expensive shoes clattering against the ancient stones as she fled through the iron gates. The 23rd nanny in 6 months. Aldrich's jaw clenched as he watched another marble statue crack down the middle, splitting the face of his grandfather in two. Around the courtyard, royal guards struggled to maintain their footing as the psychic storm intensified. Young Seraphina stood at the center of it all, her silver hair whipping wildly around her pale face, tears streaming down her cheeks. She couldn't hear her father calling her name. She couldn't hear anything at all. Born deaf into a world where vampire royalty communicated through both spoken word and ancient telepathy, Seraphina existed in absolute silence. But worse, her emerging psychic powers had no outlet, no control. They leaked from her mind like poison, turning every emotion into a weapon. "Your Majesty, we must sedate her," Lord Castellan shouted over the howling wind that had begun to tear through the open courtyard. Papers swirled through the air like desperate birds. "No." Aldrich's eyes flashed dangerous gold. "She's terrified, not malicious. We sedate her again, and we lose another week of progress." "What progress?" Lady Morgan, the head of the Royal Council, stepped forward with her dark robes billowing. Her voice cut through the chaos like ice. "Sire, with respect, there has been no progress. The child grows more volatile by the day. The previous nanny lasted 3 hours. This one made it to 2-inch. Another window shattered. Guards dove for cover." Aldrich moved slowly toward his daughter, his ancient power forming a shield around him that bent the psychic waves away. At 800 years old, he was one of the strongest vampires in existence, but even he felt the strain of Seraphina's uncontrolled force. His 7-year-old daughter possessed power that shouldn't manifest until adolescence, raw, untrained, and devastating. "Seraphina," he said softly, knowing she couldn't hear but hoping she might sense his presence. "Little star, please. I'm here." The girl's violet eyes found his, filled with such profound loneliness that Aldrich's chest ached. For a moment, the storm wavered. Then Seraphina's face crumpled with fresh despair, and the psychic blast intensified, throwing even Aldrich back several steps. She thought she'd hurt him. The guilt and fear in her expression said everything. "Enough of this madness." Lord Valen emerged from the covered walkway, his silver hair perfectly arranged despite the chaos. "The council has tolerated this danger long enough, Your Majesty. The princess must be contained in the warded chambers until she reaches maturity. For everyone's safety." "You mean imprisoned?" Aldrich snarled. "She's a child, not a monster." "She's both," Valen said coldly, gesturing to the destruction around them. "And you're too blinded by fatherly love to see it. How many more must suffer before you accept reality?" Seraphina's silent scream grew stronger. Blood began to drip from the ears of nearby guards. One collapsed entirely. Aldrich's hands curled into fists. His daughter was slipping further away with each passing day, trapped in her own mind, unable to express her thoughts or feelings except through destruction. Every specialist, every nanny, Every expert had failed. They approached her with pity or fear, speaking at her in loud voices, as if volume could bridge the gap to her deaf ears. They tried to force her into their methods, their systems, their expectations. None of them had simply tried to understand her. "Your Majesty," Lady Morgan said quietly, almost gently. "Perhaps Lord Valen is right. If we cannot find someone who can reach her, then we find someone," Aldrich interrupted, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "We expand the search. We've exhausted every qualified candidate in the 5 territories. Then we hire the unqualified." Aldrich turned to face the council, his expression fierce. "Send recruiters to every corner of the realm. Offer any price. Promise any reward. I want every servant, every peasant, every human who might possibly."
Mums.
Valen laughed sharply. "You cannot be serious. It's forbidden for humans to serve in the royal household, especially with access to the princess. The law is absolute." "I am the law," Aldrich said softly, dangerously. "And I am changing it. Effective immediately." A collective gasp rippled through the assembled vampires. Even Lady Morgan looked shocked. "This is desperation speaking," Valen pressed. "Humans are weak, short-lived, and lack any psychic sensitivity. What could they possibly offer that our own kind cannot?" Aldrich looked back at his daughter, still trapped in her storm of grief and power. "Something we've apparently forgotten," he said quietly. "Humanity." The council erupted in protests, but Aldrich raised his hand for silence. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Send the recruiters tonight. To every human settlement within 3 days' travel. Find me anyone willing to try. I don't care about their qualifications or their bloodline. I care about their heart. And if this human fails like all the others?" Valen challenged. Aldrich's eyes glowed crimson in the dimming light. "Then I'll have tried everything before I lock my daughter away forever." His voice broke slightly on the last word. "Now go, before I lose what little patience I have left." As the council members hurried away to carry out his orders, Aldrich finally reached Serafina. He knelt beside her, letting her uncontrolled power wash over him, and pulled his sobbing daughter into his arms. The psychic storm battered against him, but he held firm. She couldn't hear his whispered promises. She couldn't hear him say he loved her, that he'd find someone to help, that she wasn't alone. But perhaps, somewhere in her silent world, she could feel it. 300 miles away, in a dying mining town where the sun still rose, a young woman named Mira collapsed from exhaustion on a tavern floor, unaware that her impossible fate was already racing toward her through the darkness. Myra's cheek pressed against cold wooden floorboards, and for a moment, she couldn't remember why she'd fallen. The mop bucket had tipped over, dirty water spreading across the tavern floor like a gray stain. Above her, the innkeeper's furious face swam into view. "Get up, you lazy wretch." "I'm sorry, Mira tried to push herself upright, but her arms trembled violently. When had she last eaten? Yesterday morning? The day before? "That's it. You're done." The innkeeper grabbed Myra's threadbare sleeve and hauled her toward the door. "I can't have staff collapsing during business hours. You're frightening the customers." "Please," Mira gasped, her vision spotting with darkness. "I need this job. My brother's medicine." "Not my problem." The door slammed in her face. Mira stood in the dusty street, staring at the weathered wood. She'd worked at the Silver Tankard for 8 months, scrubbing floors until her hands cracked and bled, carrying heavy trays until her shoulders burned. All for 3 copper coins a week and 1 meal a day. Not enough. Never enough. She turned slowly and walked toward the tiny room she shared with her brother at the boarding house. Her legs felt disconnected from her body, moving through sheer habit. The mining town of Ashford was dying, had been dying for years, ever since the silver veins ran dry. Most families had already left for the cities, but Mira couldn't afford the travel permits, and Thomas was too sick to move. The boarding house stairs creaked under her weight. Mrs. Hemlock, their landlady, stood at the top with her arms crossed. "Rent's 3 days late, girl." I know. I'll have it tomorrow. That's what you said yesterday. Mrs. Hemlock's expression wasn't cruel, just tired. I've got my own bills, Mira. If you can't pay by tomorrow noon, you're both out. The door to their room hung slightly crooked on its hinges. Inside, Thomas lay curled on the single mattress they shared, his small body racked with coughing. At 9 years old, he should have been running through streets and climbing trees. Instead, he could barely sit up without losing his breath. Mira? His voice came weak and raspy. Did you bring food? She knelt beside him, forcing a smile. Not yet, little bird.
Soon.
Thomas's fever-bright eyes studied her face. Too perceptive for his age. You got fired, didn't you? Just a small setback. She pressed her hand to his forehead, still burning hot. The medicine the town healer had prescribed cost 2 silver coins. 2 silver coins she didn't have. Without it, Thomas would be dead within a week. Mira had already sold everything they owned except the clothes on their backs and their mother's wedding ring, which hung on a chain around her neck. The ring she'd sworn never to part with, no matter how desperate things became. Things had become desperate. She pulled the chain over her head, the small silver band catching the dim light from their single candle. I'll be back soon. Where are you going? To make everything better. The pawnshop was closing when Mira arrived, but old Mr. Garrett let her in anyway. He examined the ring with his jeweler's glass, and Myra's heart sank at his expression. Silver's not worth much these days, girl. I can give you 8 copper coins. That's not enough. I need 2 silver for medicine. Then you'll need to find something else to sell. He pushed the ring back across the counter.
I'm sorry.
Mira walked back outside, clutching the ring so tightly the band cut into her palm. The sun was setting, painting Ashford in shades of amber and ash. Somewhere, a dog barked. Somewhere, a mother called her children home for supper. Mira had no home to return to. Not anymore. By tomorrow, she and Thomas would be on the streets, and he would die, and it would be her fault for not being strong enough, clever enough, desperate enough. Excuse me, miss. The voice came from behind her, smooth and oddly formal. Mira turned to find a man standing in the shadows of the alley. He wore expensive traveling clothes, completely out of place in Ashford's poverty. His pale skin seemed to glow in the dimming light. I apologize for startling you, he said, stepping forward slightly. My name is Theron. I'm a recruiter for a very wealthy household in the Northern Territories. We're seeking domestic staff for an urgent position. Myra's hand instinctively clutched her mother's ring tighter. I don't have money for travel permits. All expenses paid, of course. Plus an advance on your salary. Theron produced a small leather purse and held it out. Even from several feet away, Mira could hear the heavy clink of silver coins. 5 silver immediately, 50 more per month. The world tilted sideways. 50 silver per month was more than most families in Ashford earned in a year. What's the position? Mira asked carefully. Nothing was ever free. There had to be a catch. Housekeeping duties. Cleaning. Basic service. Theron's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. The household is
Particular about their staff.
The position comes with room and board. You could bring your brother. I understand he requires medical care. The household physician is exceptional. How did he know about Thomas? Where exactly is this household? The Crimson Citadel. Theron watched her reaction carefully. You've heard of it. Every human had heard of it. The Vampire Royal Palace, deep in the territories where sunlight barely reached, where humans were forbidden to enter except as prisoners or tribute. You want me to work for vampires, Mira said slowly. The pay reflects the unique nature of the position. Why me?
I'm nobody.
The family requires someone uncomplicated, someone desperate enough to accept without asking too many questions. Theron's expression remained neutral. Someone who has nothing left to lose. He was right. Mira had nothing. No job, no money, no options. Thomas would die, and she would have failed him just like she'd failed their parents. But vampires. Everyone knew the stories, the bloodlust, the cruelty, the absolute power they wielded over human lives. Going to the Crimson Citadel meant leaving behind everything she'd ever known, stepping into a world of monsters. The carriage leaves in 1 hour, Theron said quietly. I'll be at the North Road. If you change your mind, there will be others. He disappeared into the alley before Mira could respond. She stood alone in the empty street, the purse of silver coins heavy in her suddenly trembling hands, and wondered if she'd just agreed to save her brother's life or sell her own soul. Behind her, the sun finally set, and the first stars appeared like distant, indifferent eyes. The carriage journey took 2 days through forests so thick that sunlight became a distant memory. Mira held Thomas close as he slept fitfully against her shoulder, his fever finally broken thanks to the medicine Theron had provided before they departed. Real medicine, the kind that actually worked, not the watered-down tonics from Ashford's charlatan healer. Already, Thomas's breathing came easier. Already, Mira knew she'd made the right choice. Even if terror clawed at her throat with every mile they traveled deeper into vampire territory. We're here, Theron announced as the carriage rolled to a stop. Mira stepped out and immediately understood why they called it the Crimson Citadel. The palace rose before her like a mountain of blood-red stone, its towers piercing the perpetually gray sky. Everything here existed in twilight, not quite day, not quite night. The air tasted different, heavier somehow, thick with ancient power that made her skin prickle. Thomas will be taken to the servants' quarters, Theron said, gesturing to a kind-faced older woman who emerged from a side entrance. Mrs. Calloway will ensure he's comfortable and continues his treatment. Wait. Mira grabbed her brother's hand as the woman reached for him. I want to stay with him. You have an appointment with the king, Theron said flatly.
Now.
The words hit like a physical blow. The king? You said I'd be doing housekeeping. You will be. After you're approved, Theron's expression remained unreadable. Most applicants don't make it past the interview. If you fail, you'll be returned to Ashford with the silver you've already been paid.
If you succeed, he paused. Well.
Let's focus on surviving the next hour. Mira? Thomas's small hand squeezed hers, his eyes worried despite his exhaustion. She knelt down, forcing her voice steady. I'll be fine, little bird. You go rest and I'll see you very soon. I promise. Mrs. Calloway led Thomas away, and Mira watched until they disappeared through a servant's entrance. Then Theron was guiding her up massive stone steps, through doors that could have accommodated giants, into a palace that seemed designed to make humans feel insignificant. It worked. Vampires lined the corridors, servants, guards, nobility, all impossibly beautiful and cold as winter frost. They stared at Mira as she passed, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright disgust. Whispers followed her like ghosts. Is that the human? Desperate times indeed. She won't last an hour. Look how she trembles. The king has finally lost his mind. Mira kept her eyes forward, her chin up despite the fear turning her legs to water. She'd survived 9 years raising Thomas alone after their parents died in the mine collapse. She'd survived starvation, exhaustion, and the slow death of hope. She could survive this. Theron stopped before an enormous door carved with scenes of battles and bloodshed. Remember, address him as Your Majesty. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't make direct eye contact for too long. And whatever you do, don't mention the princess until he brings her up. What princess? The door opened before Theron could answer. The room beyond was smaller than Mira expected, a private study rather than a throne room. Bookshelves lined the walls, and a fire crackled in an enormous hearth despite the lack of cold. At the center stood a man who could only be King Aldrich Varen. He was tall, his dark hair touched with silver at the temples, his face hard and beautiful in the way of ancient statues. But it was his eyes that held Mira frozen. They burned with barely contained anguish, the look of someone pushed far beyond their breaking point. You're the human, he said. Not a question. Yes, Your Majesty. Mira's voice came out steadier than she felt. My name is Mira. Can you read? The question caught her off guard. A little. My mother taught me before. Can you be patient? Aldrich interrupted, taking a step closer. The firelight cast sharp shadows across his face. Can you sit in silence without expecting reward or acknowledgement? Can you try something new when everything you've been taught tells you to give up? I think so. You think? His voice rose slightly, frustration bleeding through. I don't need someone who thinks. I need someone who can do the impossible. Behind Mira, Theron shifted uncomfortably. Your Majesty, perhaps I should explain the position. Get out. Theron bowed and disappeared with supernatural speed, leaving Mira alone with the Vampire King. The door clicked shut with terrible finality. Aldrich moved to the window, his back to her. 23 trained professionals have failed, he said quietly. Experts in child psychology, behavior modification, psychic development. All of them ran screaming. He turned to face her. Do you know why I'm hiring a human housemaid with no experience? Mira shook her head. Because I'm out of options. Because maybe someone without all that expertise won't make the same mistakes. His expression turned desperate. My daughter is 7 years old. She's deaf, and her psychic powers are destroying everything around her, including herself. She can't communicate. She can't control her abilities. And she's so terrified and alone that she's slowly losing her mind. The raw pain in his voice made Myra's chest ache. She knew that fear, had felt it every time Thomas stopped breathing, every time his fever spiked beyond what his small body could endure. The previous nanny lasted 2 hours before my daughter's panic threw her through a stone wall, Aldrich continued. You'll be working directly with Serafina, trying to find any way to reach her. The pay is substantial because the danger is real. You could be killed. You will definitely be hurt, he studied her face. Why would you possibly accept this? Mira thought of Thomas, his labored breathing, his fever-bright eyes. She thought of all the times she'd felt helpless, unable to bridge the gap between his suffering and her inability to fix it. Because I know what it's like, she said quietly, to watch someone you love suffer and not be able to help them. Something shifted in Aldrich's expression, recognition perhaps, or hope. Then let's see if you can do what no one else has managed. He moved toward another door at the back of the study. She's in the training room. Fair warning, she won't make this easy. Mira followed him, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the door, down a corridor lined with strange glowing symbols, into a vast room with walls covered in protective wards. At the far end, behind a massive stone column, Mira could see a small figure curled into a tight ball. Princess Serafina, alone in her silent prison of fear and power. The training room felt wrong, too big, too cold, designed like a cage rather than a space for a child. Scorch marks scarred the walls where psychic energy had burned through protective wards. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor like the aftermath of a battle. And there, behind the stone column, a little girl with silver hair tried to make herself invisible. Serafina, King Aldrich called gently. Someone new is here to meet you. The child didn't move. Couldn't hear him. Mira watched as Aldrich's shoulders sagged with familiar defeat. He'd probably repeated this scene 24 times, each attempt ending in violence and tears. He looked at Mira with exhausted eyes that said he expected the same result but couldn't stop trying anyway. I'll be watching from behind the barrier, he said quietly, gesturing to a transparent shield that separated the entrance from the rest of the room. If anything goes wrong, run. Don't try to be brave. Then he was gone, and Mira stood alone in the vast space with a terrified child who couldn't hear her coming. All the previous nannies had probably marched right up to Serafina, speaking loudly or trying to physically pull her out from hiding, treating her like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be understood. Mira had learned something different from Thomas during his worst fever dreams, when he couldn't recognize her and thrashed against her touch. Sometimes the kindest thing you could do was simply be present without demanding anything in return. She sat down on the floor, a good 20 feet from the pillar, and waited. Nothing happened. The silence stretched out, broken only by Myra's breathing and the distant sound of wind against the palace walls. She could feel Serafina's awareness of her, a prickling sensation like invisible eyes watching from the darkness. After several long minutes, Mira slowly reached out and tapped her knuckles against the stone floor. 3 soft knocks. Then waited. No response. She tried again. 3 knocks, then a pause, then 2 knocks. A simple rhythm, meaningless except as proof that Mira was here and not going away. Still nothing. Mira settled in, making herself comfortable on the cold floor. She continued the pattern, 3 knocks, pause, 2 knocks, over and over, never changing the rhythm, never moving closer, never demanding acknowledgement. Just being present, patient, persistent. Behind the barrier, she could sense Aldrich's confusion. This wasn't treatment or therapy. It wasn't even communication, really. It was just rhythm,
Pattern.
predictability. 10 minutes passed. 15. Myra's knuckles began to ache, but she didn't stop. Then, so faint she almost missed it, 3 answering taps came from behind the pillar. Myra's heart jumped, but she forced herself to remain calm. She tapped back. 2 knocks. A pause. Then 2 answering knocks from Serafina. They were talking. Not with words, not with signs, but with the most basic form of communication possible. I'm here. Are you there? Yes, I'm here too. Mira changed the pattern slightly. 4 taps. Pause. 1 tap. Serafina copied it back perfectly. Mira made it more complex. 2 taps. Pause. 3 taps. Pause. 1 tap. Again, Serafina matched it exactly, and this time the response came faster, more confident. For the first time, Mira risked a glance toward the pillar. She could see the edge of a small bare foot, pale as moonlight, peeking out from behind the stone. Serafina had moved slightly, curiosity overcoming fear. Mira smiled and returned to their pattern game. She made the rhythms increasingly elaborate. 5 taps, pause, 2 taps, pause, 3 taps, and Serafina followed each one with what almost sounded like enthusiasm. The girl was brilliant, memorizing complex sequences after hearing them just once. After 20 minutes of this simple exchange, something extraordinary happened. A small hand appeared around the edge of the pillar, fingers spread against the stone. Then another hand. And finally, Serafina's face emerged, huge violet eyes and a pale, delicate face, framed by silver hair that fell past her shoulders. She looked at Mira with an expression of such desperate hope it made breathing difficult. Mira carefully raised her own hand and waved, keeping her movements slow and non-threatening. Serafina didn't wave back. Instead, she took one hesitant step forward, then another, until she stood fully visible in the center of the room. She was tiny, small for 7 years old, and wore a simple white dress that made her look like a ghost of herself. The air around her shimmered slightly, with barely contained power. Mira could feel it now, pressing against her skin like invisible hands. The psychic energy that everyone feared, that had hurt so many people. But Serafina wasn't attacking. She was waiting. Mira slowly stood, then sat back down on the floor, in a different spot, closer to the middle of the room. She tapped out a new pattern, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Serafina's eyes widened with understanding. She walked forward carefully, sat down exactly where Mira had been sitting before, and tapped back, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. She'd reversed the pattern. Not just copying, playing. Mira felt tears prick her eyes, but blinked them away. She tapped out a question pattern. 3, pause 3, pause 3. Serafina cocked her head, considering. Then she tapped back, 3, 3, 3, followed by 4. She was answering, creating responses, not just mimicking. The brilliant little mind trapped inside that silent world was reaching out, trying desperately to connect. The shimmering psychic energy around Serafina began to fade, pulled back under control for the first time in months. The oppressive pressure in the room lifted like a storm cloud dispersing. Behind the barrier, Aldrich stood frozen, one hand pressed against the transparent shield, his expression transformed by disbelief and desperate hope. Serafina noticed Mira looking past her and turned to see her father. For a moment, her face crumpled with guilt, the automatic response of a child who believed her very existence caused pain. But then Mira tapped the floor urgently. Tap, 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 tap. Serafina spun back around, distracted from her spiral of guilt.
She tapped back. Top, 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 top.
They continued their pattern game for another 10 minutes, and not once did Serafina's power lash out. Not once did anything break or shatter or burn. The impossible had happened. When Mira finally stood and slowly approached, Serafina didn't flinch away. She looked up at this strange human woman who had sat on a floor and tapped stones like an idiot, who had waited patiently without demands or expectations, who had simply offered presence and pattern and proof that Serafina wasn't alone. Mira knelt down until they were eye level and placed her hand flat on the floor between them, an invitation, not a demand. After a long moment, Serafina reached out and placed her small, pale hand on top of Mira's. The psychic storm that had terrorized the citadel for months remained perfectly, miraculously calm. In the observation area, King Aldrich Varen pressed his forehead against the barrier and allowed himself to cry for the first time in a century. 3 days had passed since the breakthrough, and Mira had barely left Serafina's side. They'd moved beyond simple tapping patterns to more elaborate games, clapping rhythms, arranging stones in sequences, even a primitive form of storytelling using objects in the room to represent characters and actions. But something was missing. Serafina understood the patterns, could create complex responses, but frustration still flickered across her face whenever she tried to express something beyond simple concepts. She would gesture urgently, her small hands moving in shapes that meant nothing to Mira, and then her eyes would fill with tears when Mira couldn't understand. "Give it time," Aldrich said during their evening meeting in his study. He looked different now. The desperate edge of panic had softened into cautious optimism. "You've accomplished more in 3 days than anyone has in 3 years. "She's trying to tell me something important," Mira insisted. "I can see it in her eyes. She's desperate to communicate, but tapping patterns aren't enough. The royal scholars believe her deafness may be blocking her natural telepathic development," Aldrich explained, pouring wine he didn't drink into a glass he didn't touch. Nervous habits from a life he'd lived centuries ago. Vampire children typically begin mind-speaking around age 5, but Serafina can't hear the verbal component that guides the process. Her power has nowhere to go except outward in violence. Mira thought of Thomas, how he'd once tried to describe colors during his fever dreams, concepts that existed beyond words, impossible to explain to someone who'd never experienced them. "What if the communication isn't blocked?" she said slowly. "What if we're just not listening the right way?" The next afternoon, Mira asked permission to take Serafina to the palace gardens. Aldrich hesitated. The princess hadn't been outside the warded training room in months, but finally agreed, posting guards at discreet distances. The garden was beautiful in the eternal twilight, with night-blooming flowers that glowed faintly silver and fountains that sang without sound. Serafina's eyes went wide with wonder, her hand clutching Mira's tightly as they walked along paths lined with luminescent moss. They settled on a stone bench beside a fountain carved in the shape of intertwined dragons. Serafina picked up a fallen flower petal and held it up to the dim light, fascinated by how it glowed. Then she reached for Mira's hand and pressed the petal into her palm, closing Mira's fingers around it. The world exploded. Not with violence, with sensation. Images flooded Mira's mind, colors more vivid than anything she'd ever seen, emotions that had no names, fragments of memories that didn't belong to her. She saw the palace through Serafina's eyes, felt the princess's crushing loneliness, experienced the terror of having power she couldn't control. Mira gasped and nearly pulled away, but Serafina's grip tightened desperately. The child's violet eyes were wide with hope and fear. "Please understand. Please don't run. Please see me." And suddenly, beneath the overwhelming flood of sensation, Mira heard something. Not a voice exactly, but a presence. A thought that felt like words. Alone. So alone. "Nobody hears." "I hear you," Mira whispered. The psychic connection stuttered with shock, then intensified. More images came. Serafina's mother, beautiful and cold, dying during childbirth. Years of silence. Nannies who shouted at her, who grabbed her roughly, who looked at her with pity or fear but never understanding. The crushing weight of power she didn't want and couldn't stop. Then, impossibly, Mira understood. The near-death fever she'd survived at age 15, the one that had left her hearing strangely sensitive to people's emotions, it hadn't just heightened her senses. It had rewired something fundamental in her brain, creating pathways that could receive what Serafina desperately needed to transmit. She wasn't telepathic. Not really. But she was receptive. Open in a way that others couldn't be. Serafina, Mira said gently, squeezing the girl's hand. Can you hear my thoughts? A hesitant pulse of acknowledgement rippled through their connection. Not words, but meaning, some feelings, pictures. Show me what you want to say. The images came faster now, more controlled. Serafina showed Mira a memory of the training room, guards entering with a new nanny, the woman's thoughts screaming fear and disgust so loudly that Serafina had felt them like physical blows. The princess hadn't attacked out of cruelty. She'd lashed out in self-defense against the overwhelming hatred and terror directed at her mind. Oh, sweetheart, tears spilled down Myra's cheeks. You were just trying to protect yourself. Everyone loud. Everyone screaming inside. Hurts. But I don't hurt you. An image formed, Mira sitting on the floor, tapping stones. In Serafina's perception, Myra's mind was like a calm pond, emotions present but gentle, thoughts soft and patient.
No screaming.
No fear, hate, disgust crashing against Serafina's raw psychic sensitivity. That's why the tapping had worked. Myra's thoughts had been genuinely quiet, focused only on the simple pattern, creating a space of peace in Serafina's chaotic world of constant psychic noise. I understand now, Mira said. You're not broken. You're just hearing everything everyone thinks, all the time, and it's too much. Too much, Serafina agreed, the thought tinged with relief at finally being understood. Can't stop. Can't hide. We'll figure it out together, Mira promised. I'll help you learn to control it, to filter out the noise. You're not alone anymore. For the first time, Serafina smiled, a tiny, fragile thing that transformed her entire face. She threw her arms around Myra's neck and buried her face in her shoulder, and through their connection, Mira felt waves of gratitude and hope and something that felt almost like love. Behind a distant tree, one of the guards, a vampire named Cashin, shifted uncomfortably. He'd been assigned to watch for danger, but what he'd just witnessed felt far more significant than his duty required. The human woman and the cursed princess, sitting together in the garden, having what looked like a simple conversation but was clearly something else entirely. Something that would change everything. He filed away the memory to report to Lord Valen later, unaware that his simple observation would set far darker events into motion. In the garden, Serafina pulled back and carefully pressed her forehead against Myra's, maintaining their connection. Through the link, she sent one more thought, clearer than any before.
Safe.
You safe.
Keep safe.
Yes, Mira whispered. You keep me safe, and I'll keep you safe. Deal? The princess's smile widened, and for the first time in her short, painful life, Serafina believed someone actually understood her. The impossible had become reality. Lord Valen's private chambers occupied the western tower, far from the king's quarters and prying eyes. He stood before a mirror that showed no reflection, vampires cast none, and listened as Cashin delivered his report. The human touched the princess's hand, and both went completely still for nearly 10 minutes, Cashin explained. When they separated, the child was
different. Calmer.
Almost happy. Telepathic contact, Valen said quietly, his mind racing. The girl's power is awakening properly. Because of a human. Behind him, Lady Morgan, they emerged from the shadows. Unlike Aldrich, she'd never believed the princess was simply troubled. She'd seen the prophecy buried in the ancient texts, a deaf royal who would hear the thoughts of thousands, who would command minds like others commanded armies. A weapon beyond imagining, or a threat beyond controlling. If the child learns to focus her abilities, Morgana said, she could read the thoughts of the entire council. She could expose every secret, every alliance, every whispered treason. She could rule absolutely, Valen added. No vampire in history has possessed such power at such a young age. Not even Aldrich. They exchanged loaded glances. Both had served the crown for centuries, but both also remembered the old ways, when the strongest ruled, when power determined succession, when kings could be replaced if they grew weak or foolish. Aldrich had grown weak. His obsession with his daughter had blinded him to political realities. He'd broken sacred laws by allowing humans into the royal household, set dangerous precedents that threatened vampire superiority. The human must be removed, Morgana stated. Quietly. An accident during the princess's next episode. It won't look like an accident if the girl has no episodes, Valen countered. We need to force one. Push the princess beyond control, let her kill the human herself. Aldrich will have no choice but to imprison Seraphina then, and we can guide him back to reason. Cassian shifted uncomfortably. The king has grown, attached to the human. He speaks of her with the same protectiveness he shows his daughter. Then we move carefully, Valen said. And quickly, before their bond grows stronger. Mira didn't notice the watching eyes or sense the danger coalescing around her. She was too focused on Seraphina's breakthrough, too exhausted from the emotional intensity of their telepathic exchanges. Each session left her drained, as if the princess's thoughts drank something vital from her mind. But the progress was extraordinary. Within a week, Seraphina could project simple concepts clearly: hungry, tired, scared, happy. They developed a wordless language of emotions and images that transcended the need for sound or signs. You need rest, Aldrich said one evening, finding Mira asleep in a chair beside Seraphina's bed. The princess slept peacefully, her small hand clutching Myra's. You're burning yourself out. I'm fine, Mira mumbled, though dark circles shadowed her eyes. Aldrich gently lifted Seraphina's hand away and gestured for Mira to follow him into the corridor. I've seen soldiers push themselves to collapse. You're exhibiting the same signs. Telepathic contact is draining for both parties, and you're human. You don't have our resilience. She needs me. She needs you alive and conscious, his expression softened. You've given me back my daughter. Don't make me lose both of you to stubbornness. Mira wanted to argue, but exhaustion won. She nodded and let Aldrich guide her to the servants' quarters, where Thomas waited. Her brother had transformed in just 2 weeks. His cheeks held color now, his breathing came easy, and he'd gained enough weight that his ribs no longer showed through a shirt. Mrs. Calloway had been feeding him 3 meals a day plus honeyed milk at bedtime. You look terrible, Thomas said bluntly when Mira entered their shared room. Thanks, little bird. Is the princess really as scary as everyone says? Mira sat on the bed and pulled Thomas close.
No.
She's scared, not scary. There's a difference. The other servants whisper about her. Thomas said quietly. They say she's cursed. That she'll kill you eventually, like she tried to kill all the others. People fear what they don't understand. Do you understand her? Mira thought about Seraphina's mind. The brilliant, beautiful, broken consciousness that reached for connection with desperate hope. I'm learning to. That night, Mira slept deeply for the first time in weeks. Too deeply to hear the soft footsteps in the corridor. Too deeply to sense the guard entering Thomas's room next door, carrying a syringe of clear liquid. Too deeply to know that in the morning, when she found Thomas unconscious with a raging fever, the palace physician would diagnose him with sudden relapse and recommend quarantine. Too deeply to realize she'd been given an impossible choice: abandon Seraphina to save her brother, or stay and watch Thomas die. It's progressing faster than expected, Morgana reported to Valen the next morning. The human will be emotionally devastated, unable to focus. When she's with the princess today, I've arranged for one of our people to accidentally trigger a traumatic memory in the girl's mind. And the princess will sense her guardian's distress, Valen finished, and lose control trying to protect her.
Perfect.
They didn't know that Serafina had already sensed something wrong. That, even in sleep, the princess's growing telepathic range had brushed against Thomas's fading consciousness. That when Mira arrived at the training room that morning, tears streaming down her face, Serafina would feel every ounce of her grief and terror. That the psychic storm everyone feared would return, not as uncontrolled chaos, but as focused, protective fury. The princess was learning.
And she was learning fast.
Myra's hands shook as she tried to tap out their usual greeting pattern on the training room floor. The rhythm came out wrong, fractured by the panic flooding her system. Thomas was dying. Again, and the palace physician insisted he needed complete isolation for at least 3 days before the fever would break. 3 days Serafina would be alone with her confusion and fear. 3 days Thomas might not have. Hurting, Serafina's voice whispered in Myra's mind, the princess appearing from behind her pillar faster than usual. You hurting?
Why?
I'm fine, Myra lied, forcing a smile that felt like breaking glass. Serafina's eyes narrowed. She'd grown too perceptive, too attuned to Myra's emotional landscape. She pressed her small hand against Myra's cheek, and the telepathic connection opened like a floodgate. Images spilled through, Thomas lying unconscious, his breathing shallow. The physician's grave expression. Mrs. Calloway's worried whispers. And beneath it all, Myra's bone-deep terror that she'd lose her brother after everything they'd survived. Brother sick, Serafina understood immediately. Like before sick. Yes, but he'll be. A wave of protective fury rolled through their connection, making Myra gasp. Serafina's power had grown exponentially in 2 weeks, and now it surged outward instinctively, responding to Myra's distress. No, wait. Myra grabbed the princess's shoulders.
I'm okay.
You're okay. We just need to stay calm. But across the palace, in Thomas's quarantine room, something strange happened. The boy's fever spiked dangerously, then suddenly dropped by 2 degrees. His breathing steadied. The physician checking his vitals stumbled backward in shock as color returned to the child's face. Serafina had reached across the entire citadel and touched another mind, pulling the sickness away through sheer force of will. She didn't understand what she'd done. Only that Myra's brother had been hurting, and now he hurt less, and Myra's emotions had shifted from terror to confused hope.
Did you
heal him? Myra whispered. Serafina tilted her head uncertain. Made the bad quiet. Like you make my thoughts quiet. Before Myra could process this impossibility, the training room door opened. A servant entered carrying a tray of tea and small cakes, the afternoon refreshments that had become routine. For you, miss, the servant said with a polite bow, setting the tray on a nearby table. Something felt wrong. The servant's thoughts, usually a low background hum Serafina barely noticed, screamed with nervous energy. Through their still-open connection, Myra felt the princess's confusion at the discordant sensation. Thank you, Myra said carefully, studying the woman's face. She didn't recognize the servant. Usually Mrs. Calloway brought their refreshments. The woman left quickly, and Serafina immediately grabbed Myra's wrist.
Wrong.
Thoughts wrong. Scared, guilty rushing. Maybe she's new and nervous, Myra suggested, but she didn't touch the tea. I believe the child is correct, a voice said from the doorway. Aldrich entered with 2 royal guards, his expression dark as a storm. He moved to the tea tray and carefully lifted the cup, sniffing its contents. His eyes flashed crimson. Nightshade, he said quietly. Enough to kill a human within minutes. Cause a vampire significant pain. He set the cup down with lethal gentleness. Someone just tried to poison my daughter's guardian. The words hung in the air like frost. Serafina's power crackled visibly around her, silver threads of psychic energy dancing across her skin. Cashin. Aldrich called to one of the guards. Find that servant.
Now.
There's more, Your Majesty, Cashin said, his expression troubled. The human boy's illness. The physician found traces of the same compound in his system. Someone poisoned him 2 days ago. Everything clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Thomas's sudden relapse. The impossible timing. The pressure to leave Serafina alone and vulnerable. They wanted to separate us, Mira breathed. Distract me, make me too worried to focus. And trigger an episode that would kill you both, Aldrich finished grimly, making it look like the princess's fault. Not my fault, Serafina projected fiercely. Protect Mira. Protect brother. Not hurt them. Her power exploded outward, but this time with purpose. Aldrich threw up a barrier instinctively, but the psychic wave washed past him harmlessly, searching, seeking. Throughout the palace, every vampire with telepathic sensitivity gasped as Serafina's consciousness touched theirs. She was looking for the guilty thoughts. The conspiracy. In the Western Tower, Lord Valen felt the princess's mind brush against his and immediately slammed his mental shields closed. But he was too slow. Serafina had already sensed the shape of his treachery, the bitter satisfaction at his plan's near success. Him. She sent her father, the thought edged with fury.
Tower.
Silver hair. Hates me. Wants me gone. Valen, Aldrich growled. Before anyone could react, an explosion rocked the palace. The western wall of the training room shattered inward, stone and debris flying. Through the dust and chaos, 3 figures in dark cloaks rushed forward, blades gleaming. Assassins. The guards moved to intercept, but one attacker broke through, heading straight for Mira with supernatural speed. Serafina screamed, not with her voice, but with her mind, and the telepathic shockwave hit like a physical wall. The assassin froze mid-stride, his eyes going wide with terror as the princess's power invaded his consciousness.
No. Touch. Me.
The assassin's mind couldn't withstand the onslaught. He collapsed, bleeding from his eyes and ears. The other 2 attackers hesitated, seeing their companion destroyed by an invisible force. That moment of fear cost them. Aldrich moved with the speed of ancient power, his hand closing around one attacker's throat while Cashin drove his blade through the other's heart. Silence fell over the destroyed room. Mira held Serafina close, both of them trembling. The princess's power still crackled around them in a protective sphere that nothing could penetrate. She'd done it. Controlled her ability not for destruction, but for defense. Not to hurt everyone, but to protect the one person who'd shown her kindness. It's over, Aldrich said softly, approaching carefully. Serafina, they can't hurt you anymore. But the princess shook her head, her eyes wide. Through their connection, Mira felt what Serafina sensed. More guilty thoughts scattered throughout the palace. More conspirators. This wasn't over. This was only the beginning.
Danger. Serafina Warned.
Still danger. Many minds hiding. Many scared of me. Then we end this, Aldrich said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Tonight. No more shadows. No more plots. He looked at his daughter, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a broken child to be fixed, but as a powerful being learning to use her gifts. Show me, he said quietly. Show me everyone who wishes us harm. Serafina's smile was small and fierce and terrifying. The reckoning had begun. The great hall had not been filled in decades, but tonight every member of the vampire nobility crowded into the ancient chamber. Word had spread quickly. King Aldrich had summoned the entire court for an emergency session. Attendance was mandatory. Refusal meant treason. Lord Valen stood among them, his expression carefully neutral despite the cold sweat on his palms. Beside him, Lady Morgan maintained her composure, though her thoughts raced behind mental shields reinforced with centuries of practice. The massive doors opened, and silence fell like a blade. King Aldrich entered first, his crimson robes flowing behind him like blood. But it was the small figure walking beside him that made the assembled nobles gasp. Princess Serafina, dressed in silver silk that matched her hair, held her father's hand with quiet dignity. Her violet eyes swept across the crowd with unnerving awareness. And behind them, impossibly, walked the human. Mira wore simple gray, a servant's dress, but carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd survived assassination and emerged stronger. "You called a court session to parade your pet human?" Lord Breslin called out, his voice dripping with disdain. Several nobles laughed nervously. Aldrich's expression didn't change. "I called this session to address the conspiracy that attempted to murder my daughter's guardian and poison a 9-year-old child." The laughter died instantly. "Over the past 2 weeks, certain members of this court have plotted against Princess Seraphina," Aldrich continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "They poisoned a human boy to manipulate his sister. They hired assassins. They sought to trigger my daughter's powers and use her own abilities as the weapon that would kill an innocent woman." Valen's mental shields tightened, but he kept his face impassive. "Serious accusations, Your Majesty. Do you have proof?" "I have something better." Aldrich looked down at Seraphina. "Show them." The princess stepped forward, and Mira moved with her, their hands clasped together. Through their connection, Seraphina drew strength and focus, channeling her wild power into precise purpose. "Listen," her voice whispered into every mind present. 300 vampires gasped as the princess's consciousness touched theirs, not violently, but with surgical precision. She showed them memories pulled from the guilty, Valen and Morgan in the tower, plotting Myra's death. Cashin reporting to them from the garden. The servant carrying poisoned tea, her thoughts screaming with fear and coercion. Every secret, every whispered treason, every moment of conspiracy laid bare for all to witness. "No," Morgana breathed, her shields crumbling under the princess's relentless truth. "This is impossible. This is justice," Aldrich said coldly. He gestured, and guards moved to apprehend both Valen and Morgana. 5 other nobles tried to flee, but found the doors blocked. "Every conspirator will face judgment. The punishment for attempting to murder a member of the royal household is death." "She's not royal," Valen snarled, struggling against the guards holding him. "She's human. A servant. You've lost your mind over." "Enough," Aldrich's voice cracked like thunder. "For centuries, I have ruled with the council's guidance, respecting tradition and ancient law. But some laws are built on fear rather than wisdom. Some traditions serve only to maintain power rather than protect our people." He moved to stand beside Mira, placing a hand on her shoulder in a gesture that spoke volumes. "Mira saved my daughter when every expert failed. She succeeded because she possessed something our kind has forgotten: compassion without expectation, patience without pride, love without condition." His eyes swept the assembled nobles. "She is more worthy of my trust than those who share my blood, but not my values." Aldrich's voice rose, filling the hall with absolute authority. "Effective immediately, I declare Mira as Princess Seraphina's official guardian and royal advisor. She will have full access to the royal family, a seat on advisory councils, and protection under crown law. Any who harm her answer to me personally." Shock rippled through the crowd. A human, given rank and title? It was unprecedented. Unthinkable. "Furthermore," Aldrich continued, "I am lifting the ban on human servants in the royal household. Those who prove their worth through service and loyalty will be judged by their character, not their mortality." "You're destroying everything we've built," Lady Cytherea said quietly from the crowd, her expression sad rather than angry. "The old ways kept us strong. The old ways made us cruel," Aldrich countered. "My daughter possesses power beyond any vampire in recorded history. She could destroy minds with a thought, control armies with her will. And the only person she trusts absolutely is human." He let that sink in. "Perhaps that says more about us than about her." Seraphina squeezed Myra's hand, drawing her attention. Through their connection, the princess sent a question. "Can I speak?" "Are you sure?" Mira whispered. Seraphina nodded. She'd been practicing something special, something Mira had helped her develop over whispered sessions in the moonlit garden. The princess turned to face the assembled court. She couldn't speak with her voice. That would never be possible. But she had something far more powerful. Hope, her voice whispered into every mind simultaneously. The single word carried weight beyond its simplicity. It carried Seraphina's loneliness transformed into strength, her fear transformed into determination, her isolation transformed into connection. Every vampire in the hall felt it, the pure, crystalline certainty that things could change, that power could protect rather than destroy, that the cursed princess might become something extraordinary.
Some nobles wept.
Others fell to their knees. Even Valen, facing execution, felt the touch of that impossible hope and understood what he'd tried to destroy. The deaf princess who'd been locked away in fear had just spoken to an entire court, and every single one of them had heard her clearly. "The trial will commence at dawn," Aldrich announced. Court dismissed. As the nobles filed out in stunned silence, Mira pulled Seraphina into a tight embrace. "You were amazing," she whispered. "We were amazing," Seraphina corrected through their bond. Together. Later, in the royal garden under the eternal twilight, Aldrich found them sitting by the dragon fountain. Thomas had been brought from the medical wing, fully recovered, and he sat between Mira and Seraphina, teaching them both a clapping game he'd learned from the kitchen children. "Your Majesty," Mira started to stand, but Aldrich waved her down. "Just Aldrich, please." When we're alone, he sat on the grass, a king sitting in the dirt, and watched his daughter laugh silently at Thomas's exaggerated movements. "I never thought I'd see her this happy." "She's still learning," Mira cautioned. "There will be difficult days ahead." Yes, Aldrich's expression grew serious. "Word of tonight will spread beyond our borders. Other territories will hear that the vampire princess can read thoughts and speak to minds across great distances. Some will see her as a threat, others as a weapon they want to control." "Let them come," Mira said quietly, surprised by the fierceness in her own voice. "We'll protect her together." Seraphina looked up at that, feeling the determination in Mira's thoughts. She projected an image through their bond, the three of them, Aldrich, Mira, and herself, standing together against a dark horizon where distant figures gathered. "Coming," she confirmed. "Feel them, afraid and angry and wanting." "Then we'll be ready," Aldrich promised. He reached out and gently touched his daughter's cheek, and for the first time, Seraphina didn't flinch away. "Whatever comes, you're not alone anymore." As stars appeared in the perpetual twilight sky, the four of them sat together in the garden, a vampire king, a human maid, a deaf princess, and a sick boy who'd somehow healed, and for a moment, everything felt possible. In the distance, beyond the citadel walls, territorial scouts reported back to their masters. The vampire princess had awakened. The balance of power was shifting. War was coming. But tonight, in a garden full of glowing flowers, a little girl who'd spent her whole life in silence finally understood what it meant to be heard. And that made all the difference.